Disclosure: this video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations. Time to take a look at German flame tanks of the Second World War, or as they were called in German, Flammpanzer. Although tanks saw already combat in the First World War, as well as flamethrowers, it took until the 1930s for the first flamethrower tanks to be used in combat. The first notable combat deployment was by the Italians in the Abyssinian War in 1936, where the Carro Armato L333 was used. Note, it also had a trailer for the flame oil, something the Germans decided against in their designs. Speaking of tanks, this video was made possible by our sponsor, the free online PvP strategy game Conflict of Nations. The game allows you to play as a real country in a potential World War III. If you are bored fighting AI, Conflict of Nations has you covered. Fight against up to 128 other players in real-time games that can take weeks to complete. The game features an economy, research, and of course various military units. As such, it requires strategic planning. Furthermore, you can engage in ground, air and sea combat. Various gameplay mechanics allow for tactical decision making. You can build your armed forces with tanks, tank destroyers, recon units, air superiority fighters, nuclear submarines and many more units. On the political level, you can use the diplomatic system to forge alliances with other players or declare war on them to take over the world. The game is fully cross-platform and you can use the same account on both PC and mobile devices. If you click on the link in the description, you get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. The offer is only available for 30 days, so time to take action. Additionally, you help support this channel. Before we take a look at the various German flame tanks, it is important that we look at the certain limitations that flamethrowers, particularly in combination with tanks, have. The Germans conducted various experiments to use flamethrowers in tanks and by 1939 had determined what works and what doesn't work. One major problem was the limited range. One could assume just increase the pressure and this problem will go away. But there seems to be a certain physical limitation, particularly from air resistance. Jentz and Doyle note the following. In theory, as system's pressure is increased, the range of the flamethrower should correspondingly increase. But as fluid is discharged at higher pressures, the fluid velocity increases and is counteracted by an increase in air resistance. Tests conducted by the Germans proved that no matter how much higher pressure was increased, there was a maximum range associated with each nozzle size. Now, range to a certain degree could be increased by using more flame oil, but at certain points the increase in range became negligible, whereas the expenditure of flame oil was heavily increased. As such, one major decision was to go for few long-range bursts, 50 to 80 meter, or many short-range bursts up to 40 meters. Of course, another alternative would be to add an additional flame oil tank, like the Italians with the trailer. The Germans particularly decided against this one, but towing a trailer greatly restricted the maneuverability and turning radius of a tank. In order to prevent loss of the trailer, the tanks had to slow down or were impeded from crossing trenches and other obstacles. Additionally, after conducting various tests with longer range flamethrowers, it was determined that mobility was more important than longer ranges. So let us look at the first Flammpanzers, which was a field modification based on the Panzer I. There were several attempts here. The first was a field modification done in the Spanish Civil War. Here the right-hand machine gun from the turret was removed and replaced with a German standard small backpack flamethrower. A report noted that longer range flamethrowers was decided since the crew losses were relatively high. A second time the Panzer I was used during the siege of Tobruk, where again an infantry flamethrower was mounted. The next in line is the Flammpanzer based on the Panzer II, notably Ausführung D and E, which had different road wheels compared to the Ausführung C. These were the first German flame tanks that were specifically designed as flame tanks. The design and development was authorized in January 1939. Although it was based on the Panzer II chassis, there were some notable differences to the regular Panzer II. The turret had only one machine gun in the center and no 20mm autocannon. Yet it was equipped with vision blocks that were usually only used by the driver to provide better vision. It was equipped with two flamethrowers. The nozzles were mounted at the right and left front of each fender. These separately operated Spritzköpfe, spray heads, were traversable through 180 degrees, from a 9 o'clock through 3 o'clock position. Each of the Flammenwerfer had a separate flame oil container holding 160 liters, sufficient for 80 bursts of 2 to 3 seconds duration. 4 cylinders filled with compressed nitrogen provided the propulsion force. Compressed acetylene was used to ignite the flame oil. Like the regular Panzer II, it had a crew of 3 men, the commander, who was also the gunner for the machine gun and flamethrowers, the driver and the radio operator that was also a second gunner for the flamethrowers. Its armor protection was 30mm frontal and 14.5mm side armor. The frontal armor was sufficient against anti-tank weapons of up to 25mm caliber at a range of 600 meters or more. Keep in mind that the German standard anti-tank gun at the beginning of the war was the 37mm pack, which was soon to be considered obsolete. The side armor basically protected only against small arms fire. Considering the limited range of the flamethrower, this was not a lot. Keep in mind that German tanks early on had relatively low armor, even tanks like the Panzer III and IV. These flame tanks saw first action during Operation Barbarossa and suffered heavy losses due to the limited armor protection. Additionally, the organization as a battalion was considered to be unwieldy. In total, 112 were produced on the Ausführung D chassis and another 43 were converted from existing Ausführung D and E tanks. So in total about 150. Although ultimately, the surviving vehicles were converted into tank destroyers with captured Soviet guns. The battalion were reorganized into regular tank battalions with surviving personnel. Yet these were not the only Flammpanzers the Germans used during Operation Barbarossa. They also used modified French Char B2. The Char B2 had a hull-mounted 75mm gun. This was removed and the flamethrower installed instead. This initial series of 24 Panzerkampfwagen B2F were equipped with the same flamethrower system as the Panzerkampfwagen IIF, utilizing compressed nitrogen as the propellant. These tanks were comparatively well armored with up to 60mm. Yet they were also destroyed by Soviet anti-tank weapons like the 76mm guns and easily caught fire. The unit was disbanded near the end of July 1941, yet it was ordered to continue the development of a flamethrower based on this chassis. This led to another series. In this case, there was an additional flame oil tank added to the rear of the hull. The various tanks were deployed on the Eastern Front, Balkans and also on the Western Front in 1943. Production or better conversion numbers are not totally clear here. Jentz and Doyle note that at least 60 were converted based on the deployment numbers. The next German Flammpanzer was based on the Panzer III chassis. This was the first one that had a flamethrower mounted in a turret. The turret could be continuously traversed through 360 degrees by installing a packing box connection in the flame oil delivery pipe. The flamethrower and coaxially mounted MG34 could be elevated through an arc from -10 to +20 degrees. There was no sighting device other than a vane sight positioned in front of the forward viewport in the commander's cupola. 2 containers inside the hull held 1020 liters of flame oil. The range was still rather limited, 50 meters with cold flame oil and 60 if ignited. Unlike the regular Panzer III, which had a crew of 5 men, this one had only 3 men. The arrangement was similar to the Panzer II. The commander was also the gunner, the driver and the radio operator used a hull-mounted machine gun. The armor protection was 30 plus 50 millimeters, so 80mm at the front plate of the hull. Overall, it was armored that it could withstand Soviet 76mm guns at regular combat distances, but the flame tank had to deliver its load up close and personal. Additionally, it was produced in early 1943, so at a time where it only took a few months until the first Panthers would see action at the Battle of Kursk, which had strong frontal armor. In terms of production of the Panzerkampfwagen III Flamm, 100 were produced. Yet the turret was not the only change. One substantial change was in terms of organization. Previously, Flammpanzer were organized as independent army battalions, Heerestruppen, that were only attached to higher headquarters. But the Panzerkampfwagen III Flamm was issued to platoons incorporated as organic part of a normal Panzerabteilung Stabskompanie, headquarters company. In total, 7 Panzer divisions and the Panzergrenadierdivision Großdeutschland received the Panzerkampfwagen III Flamm. Keep in mind that Großdeutschland was not a regular Panzergrenadier division and received better equipment than other divisions. In terms of combat effectiveness, it was still limited. The issue is that experience reports are very rare. One report from November 1943 in Italy noted that it was the first time that the regiment achieved a favorable result with the Flammpanzer. A unit from the Eastern Front noted in the end of January 1944 that the Flammpanzer had only been used twice, and in both employments the desired objectives were not achieved. Although supported by regular tanks, the Flammpanzer suffered heavy losses. The report notes that this is due to the fact that the enemy concentrates on them and that their armor is insufficient for this. Additionally, the flamethrower tube is also highly vulnerable. A handful of surviving flame tanks were converted to Sturmgeschütze as well. Speaking of Sturmgeschütze, in December 1942 it was decided to create a single series of Sturmgeschütz with flamethrowers. Initially, a new Sturmgeschütz from the current production run should be used, but ultimately older Sturmgeschütz hulls were refurbished. They were shipped to the tank training school, but ultimately were sent to the ordnance depot and converted into regular Sturmgeschütze in 1944. Apparently, Germany had so many resources at the time to waste time, money and personnel. The next one in line is the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 25116, a half-track, not really a tank. For more information on this vehicle and tactics, see my previous video on this. The next and final Flammpanzer that saw action was the Flammpanzer 38. In November 1944, Hitler ordered a special operation that would require a large number of Flammpanzers of at least 20 to 30. For this, at least 10 Panzerkampfwagen III Flamm should be refurbished and 20 Jagdpanzer 38, usually called Hetzer, should be converted into Flammpanzer. The flamethrower was mounted instead of the 75mm gun. A container with 700 liters of flame oil was considered sufficient for 60 to 70 bursts. The propelling force was provided by a pressure from a pump. The flame oil was ignited using cartridges. An MG34 on the roof had a unique mount with a periscope that allowed the MG to be fired while buttoned up. A crew of 4 manned this 13.5-ton Flammpanzer. 2 companies were created, and these should be in the leading attack group for Operation Northwind, a German attack in the area of Alsace-Lorraine. Interestingly, the instructions by the Army Group Command notes the range of the flamethrowers as 35 meters, whereas the later combat report notes that the range of 50 meters is not sufficient and should be doubled, although as mentioned at the beginning of the video, in 1939 this was not considered feasible. By 1945 there were developments that should allow 100 to 140 millimeters though. In overall, the effectiveness is limited and there are only a handful of scenarios where flame tanks work, for instance in a swift counterattack before the enemy can deploy anti-tank weapons. Finally, there was also a design for a Tiger with a flamethrower. Hitler in December 1944 noted that a flamethrower should be mounted behind the heaviest armor possible. For this, the Tiger was considered. Additionally, he also considered using the Jagdpanzer if a range of 200 meters could be achieved. At the conference on 3rd January 1945, Hitler again emphasized the importance of developing a heavy Flammpanzer with 250mm thick armor. There was quite some back and forth, and ultimately a prototype was partially created that was then stuck on a rail car. Due to loss of 17 days in transport, the completion of an operational experimental Flammpanzer was no longer expected to occur by 15th April 1945. Further Allied troop advances and the bombing campaign disrupted any further activity associated with the completion of this experimental Schwerstflammpanzer of Tiger I. For me, the most important aspect about the Flammtiger is the following statement. Generalmajor Tomale imparted that the troops had previously rejected the Flammpanzer, but the troops had again requested a Flammpanzer after it was deployed by the enemy. In my opinion, this seems to refer to a "the grass is always greener on the other side" situation, although I'm certain that some people will point out that this clearly refers to the Churchill crocodile. This might be the case, yet even if that is true, I wonder if the crocodile could be employed successfully against an enemy that had the capabilities of the Western Allies in 1944-45. To summarize, although flame tanks seem to be a devastating weapon in theory, in practice the limitation seems to outweigh the benefits. At least that is my impression from German World War II experience, although we should add that the reports are scarce. One major issue is to the air resistance and other effects that there is a severe range limitation. This gives the enemy time to prepare, and the closer the enemy gets, the stronger the penetration capabilities of anti-tank weapons. Additionally, the chances to hit the weaker part of the tank or to immobilize increase as well. Of course, if the enemy position lacks anti-tank weapons and/or are heavily suppressed, this is less of an issue. Yet this was rarely the case for the Germans from 1943 onwards. Now be sure to click the link in the description and claim your bonus for the free online PvP strategy game Conflict of Nations. Get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free, only for the next 30 days. Choose your country, create your strategy to win in epic battles and to take over the world. Thank you to Conflict of Nations for sponsoring this video, thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script, thank you for watching and see you next time.